Hello everybody and welcome to the final tier of the serial killer Iceberg. Now I'm changing up this final tier a little bit and I'll explain why. On this final tier there were 8 terms and 3 of those were unsolved. And as I've talked about, I don't really like diving into, all the grisly stuff that happened to people. I prefer to look at the killer psychology, why they did it, how they got away, their trial, etc. And to be completely honest with you, I just thought it was kind of boring. Like, if I was to sit here and talk to you about a killer who was never identified, it'd just be me going, yeah, there were 2 people dead here, and then 3 more died over here, and that's all I got. So in an attempt to make this more interesting and also give you all some more content, I took the 5 names that were identified on this tier, and then I added another 5 serial killers that I personally find fascinating and added them for a total of 10. And by fascinating, I specifically mean that the case around it was very unique, or the bizarre details of how they managed to get away are the kind of thing that I look for with this type of content. In other words, we're taking the 5 solved from the end of this iceberg, and then I'm throwing 5 more in that I felt like should have been included. So if you're interested in that, stick around for just a second because we are going to get into it. But first of all, a couple orders of business, this being the first. So this guy is my second partnership with Makeship. Thank you to Makeship again for allowing me this opportunity. And I'm calling him Winda Dude. As you can see, he's got like my hairline, and it's the stag skull and everything, and the antlers. And like just look at his big hands and his tiny feet and like his little shirt, which also, I don't know how well you can see this on camera, but his face and shirt glow in the dark, and I think that's pretty neat. So similar to the first guy back there, he will only be available for a couple more weeks and then he's gone forever. More specifically, it's the pre-sale right now. So he's for sale for 2 weeks, and after that's over, all of the plushes that are ordered are created and then sent out to people, and he won't be for sale again. So if you're interested, link will be in the description. You guys have already blown it out of the water. I am so blessed and impressed and happy, and it's fantastic that whenever a company comes to me and says something like this, I always have doubts of, well, I don't think people are that interested, and every time you guys show me that people are that interested, and it really does warm my heart, so thank you for that. And before we begin to break down our thrilling conclusion, you know what else I'm thrilled to talk about? That's right, the best provider of merchandise for nerds like me, and probably yourself, Displate. Displate specializes by taking your favorite interest and transferring them over to these high quality metal signs. Not only is this, for one, as you can tell, a very solid metal poster, but also look how good the quality is on the color and contrast with it. Like, I'm honestly stunned. This is way better than any paper poster I've ever had. Not only that, but when I say you can find any interest on Displate, I mean any. Like, for one, here is a Vaporwave Leon Kennedy from Resident Evil 2. Here's a Vaporwave like Miami Vice poster of John Wick. And a Vaporwave Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan. Yes, I like Attack on Titan and also Vaporwave, as you can probably tell. Displate has over 1.4 million designs available. Everything from sports, history, art, Vaporwave, and the like. Not only that, but they also boast a very fast delivery, combined with the fact that every single Displate poster is signed by the head of production. So in other words, quality control with these guys is through the roof and very efficient. Also, you may be wondering how to hang it, and that's one of the wildest parts. So you just take this big sticker and you peel off the back and you put it on a wall, which I'm not doing because this is where the whiteboard goes. And then you take this magnet, peel off the back of it, put that over the sticker, and that's literally it. Then you just put it up on the wall. No nails, no hassle, no hole in your wall, nothing. For every Displate sold, a portion of the profits go to planting a tree. So while I get to satisfy my retro wave obsession, I also get to feel good about myself while I do it. And you can feel good about yourself today at a discount by using the link in the description. That's right, if you go to the link in the description, you will be able to get your Displates for a discount. And while you're there, be sure to check out some of my favorite Displates that I've saved onto my profile. It's a fantastic product of your favorite interest. I think they're really neat, and I decided to share with you. So thank you all so much for watching the ad. Thank you so much to Displate for sponsoring the video. It really does mean the most. I hope you check them out. Again, discount link in the description. And we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, Thank you for watching. I'm going to alternate with killers from the iceberg and killers that I introduced myself. So this first one is going to be one that I added. The second one will be one from the original iceberg. The third one that I added, so on and so forth. Beginning with Nikolai Dzhumagaliev, also known as Metal Fang. What better way to end the iceberg than with someone who has a name that is way cooler than they deserve? Nikolai was born on November the 15th of 1952, and by all accounts had a normal childhood as he was growing up. He was born into the USSR in a region that is today part of Kazakhstan. Because of this, he did his mandatory military service, but even then didn't show any distinct signs of aggression. The closest thing is that there are several mentions of him being in bar fights, but for most Russian soldiers at the time, that was kind of part of the job description. And after his military service, he maintained several blue-collar jobs and was a well-respected member of the community. He got the nickname Metal Fang because during one of these fights, he knocked out his front two teeth, which he replaced with white metal ones. What seemed to be the turning point for him was on one occasion after sleeping with someone from his local town, he contracted trichomoniasis and syphilis. It seems because of this, he grew an intense hatred of women. This would culminate during his first killing in January of 1979. Nikolai found a woman walking by herself on a back road which connected two different towns, to which he snuck up behind her, dragged her into the woods, and killed her. Shortly after the killing, a bus pulled up and stopped nearby on the road, so Nikolai quit moving in order to avoid detection. However, he got really cold and used the body for warmth. Perhaps the most brutal aspect of the killing is that after this event, he began to drink blood from his victim as well as take parts of her home, to which he later cooked and ate. He seemingly developed a taste for it and would continue this action several times afterwards. Later that same year, he was working as a fireman and while drunk accidentally shot and killed another fireman. Keep in mind, the police and courts had no idea about his serial killings at this point, so he was tried for just the accidental shooting. During this time, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was ultimately let off as it was ruled a total accident. Shortly after this, he began having friends over to his house for cookouts, to which it was later found out he would regularly feed them human body parts, while claiming that it was just meat from an animal he had hunted. He became so bold with this that one day during one of his parties, he got one of his friend's girlfriends to come into the bathroom with him, to which he then killed her with an axe, and during the process, another one of the party attendees saw this. He screamed, everyone ran away and contacted the police, to which whenever the police got there, he was standing there completely naked, continuing to cut up the body as if nothing had happened. And then somehow, probably because the police were so freaked out by this sight, he got away and managed to stay unapprehended for 24 hours. And I can't emphasize that enough. The police walk in, he's standing there naked, covered in blood, he runs outside, and they just couldn't catch him for a while. The next day, he was caught, however, while staying at his cousin's house, and later that year in 1981, he was found not guilty by reason of mental insanity. So for 8 years, he stayed in a home for the mentally ill. That was until he was being transferred by a caseworker in 1989, to which at some point, Nikolai managed to steal the vehicle and get away. And from that point, he just drove the car to the mountains of Kazakhstan and began hiding out there. There was one point, however, where he felt like the authorities were closing in on the manhunt with him, so he contacted one of his friends in Moscow and had him write a fake letter to Nikolai's family saying that Nikolai was currently in Moscow and he'd begin killing there. This actually worked, and the police, thinking that Nikolai is about to start a murder spree in Moscow, focused all of their efforts back there. Nikolai lived in hiding for a couple years, even at one point growing medicinal herbs and trading them with villagers. However, by 1991, he was tired of it all and decided that the best way to start his life over was to get arrested for a minor crime under a fake name. That way, when he got out, he could reintegrate to society with a seemingly workable alibi. To do this, he stole sheep and then was purposefully caught while doing it. However, whenever he was being interrogated by the police and he gave them a story that he was an immigrant from China who was just stealing sheep because he was poor, he couldn't give an answer for how he successfully got over the border and into the country. Because of this discrepancy, the interrogators invited detectives from Moscow to come help figure out what the issue was. And sure enough, the detective from Moscow who showed up to question this supposed random Chinese sheep thief was one of the detectives who was originally looking for Nikolai during the killings. Which that had to be weird for the detective. Like, imagine you've spent years looking for this serial killer with metal teeth in the middle of Moscow, and then you get a call about some sheep thief in the Ural Mountains, and whenever you get out there, it's the metal tooth cannibal guy. So now that he was caught under the correct name, he was again sentenced to a life sentence because, again, no death penalty because he was ruled mentally deficient. He was thrown back into a home and continues to live out that life sentence today. However, he frequently makes requests that they give him the death penalty, although to this date, all of them have been denied. While Nikolai was only ever officially convicted of 5 murders, it's believed the actual number is closer to a dozen. Metal Fang really caught on with the media, especially considering the cannibalistic nature of these killings, and a crazed Russian in the mountains who eats people with metal teeth is something that I'm sure the news like to run with. Benjamin Atkins was born on August 26 of 1968 in Detroit, Michigan. I have to mention this even though I have no idea what it's talking about, but every source I read about Benjamin said he ran away in 1970 at the age of 2. I don't know how a 2-year-old runs away from home, but I think I should mention that that is a thing that happened. Because of this running or crawling away or whatever happened, Benjamin was taken in by an orphanage. It was found out by caseworkers after this event that he never knew his father and his mother was a heavy drug user. Because of this dynamic, Benjamin was constantly in and out of foster care and in and out of his mother's care. However, things got complicated when Benjamin was only 10 years old and he was abused by one of the workers at the orphanage. This made the courts rule that his mother was the better option to take him given the circumstances. However, that turned out to be not good either. Benjamin's mother was a prostitute and would often bring Benjamin on her jobs, and Benjamin later recalled frequently being in the back seat while she worked in the front seat. This gave Benjamin a very intense hatred of women, and especially those who worked as prostitutes within Detroit. As he grew up, he was never really able to maintain any job for a long amount of time, and became a crack addict, mostly living in abandoned buildings around Detroit. One day, Benjamin invited a woman who was working outside of the abandoned building that he was staying in. He invited her inside so that the two could get high, but whenever she tried to leave, he killed her. And from there, that was established as his regular MO. He would lure women who he saw as undesirable into abandoned buildings, killed them, and then most often left their buildings in that location. As a matter of fact, the buildings were so often looked over that it wasn't until months later police began to realize that there was a killer on the loose. During this series of murders, Benjamin was actually interrogated by the police early on. However, he had an alibi and wasn't considered a top suspect anymore. During his killings, there was one woman who he attempted to murder who managed to fight back enough that she got away. From that point on, anytime the police thought that they had someone who may be the killer, they would bring her in order to ID him. So for several months, this woman would show up, say, no, that's not the guy, and that was just the routine. Until one day, Benjamin was arrested for a totally unrelated assault charge. However, this assault occurred in the area of one of the recent killings, so while the police were interrogating him, they had the surviving victim come, and sure enough, she ID'd him. After over 12 hours of interrogation, Benjamin eventually confessed to the 11 murders. And from there, it was later proven through things like DNA evidence and his recollection of the killings that he was in fact the killer. According to him, the first murder was accidental and due to the effects of the drugs he was taking. However, after that, he decided that he enjoyed it and continued to do it again. Perhaps one of the most brutal details of this is that his method of murder was strangulation, and he would often have them pass out and then wait for them to wake back up just so he could do it again. In April of 1994, he was convicted of 11 murders taking place over the span of 9 months. And for these 11 murders, he was given 11 life sentences. Benjamin died of an illness while in prison on September 17th of 1997, and to this day is known as the Woodward Corridor Killer. Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker, was born in Iowa in 1939. From a young age, Robert's strict dad made him work long hours in the family bakery, and Robert himself was bullied in school for having a speech impediment. He joined the Army Reserve out of high school, and it was during this time that he was renowned for his marksmanship. However, in 1960, he was arrested after burning down the school bus garage. In the court proceedings that followed, he was diagnosed as having an infantile personality. Because of his reputation in Iowa growing sour, he moved to Alaska in 1967, to which initially it seemed that life was going good for him. He had a wife and kids and was a professional big game hunter within Anchorage, Alaska. As a matter of fact, he held several state records for large game hunts he went on. However, a couple years after arriving there, he was arrested and served 6 months in jail for attacking a prostitute, and in 1977 was arrested for stealing a chainsaw for some reason. In 1980, he staged a false robbery at his house in which he said several items were stolen, and using the insurance payout money, he opened his own bakery in Anchorage, Alaska. And 2 years later, bought his own bush plane to explore the Alaskan wilderness. What was not known until years later is that during this stretch of time, Robert would go into the city and pick up prostitutes before bringing them to his private plane and flying to a small shack that he had in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Once there, he would demand them to perform several odd fantasies, to which for 30 women who performed those fantasies, he brought them back and they just assumed him to be a weird rich client. However, for at least 17 women who refused his advances, it became much darker. To, again, at least 17 victims after forcing himself onto them after they denied his advances, he would then release them into the Alaskan wilderness, to which he would then hunt them down over the next several days. In later interviews, it was shown that he would hunt them in much the way he would an animal, tracking them and stalking them through the forest. Initially, when women were found shot to death in the middle of the wilderness, the police who found their bodies thought that this was the result of some sort of gang dumping people that they killed in the middle of the wilderness. This may have went on for much longer if it wasn't for one woman who escaped in 1983. A trucker was driving down the road near Anchorage, Alaska, when he saw a woman run out of the woods with one hand handcuffed. He brought her to the police, to which she said she was working on the corner whenever a John Doe pulled up, invited her into the car. He then drove her to his house before she denied his advances. He had his way. Before taking her to the airport, and before flying away, she managed to catch him off guard for a second and run away. And somehow, by the grace of God, she remembered the tail number of the plane he tried to take her in. So the police searched the number and came to the name of Robert Hansen. Initially, his friends gave a false alibi for him, which they later recanted on, and after a lot of court hoopla, he was eventually arrested and his house searched. In his possession, they found a Ruger Mini 14, which ballistically matched the .223 bullets that were used to kill the women, as well as several souvenirs such as IDs, driver's license, or purses from the women that he had killed. He was suspected of 21 murders, and after a plea bargain that ensured he wouldn't get the death penalty, he showed investigators 17 of them. However, for whatever reason, he never showed the other 4, even though he confessed to those 4 killings. The most common theory around this, which again can't really be proven, is that perhaps those 4 that he killed weren't prostitutes, and therefore in his own twisted form of morality, he had more trouble justifying it and didn't want to confront it. Finally, on February the 18th of 1984, he was sentenced to a life sentence plus 461 years in prison, to which he died of natural causes while in prison on May the 11th of 2014. Ervil LeBaron was born on February 22nd of 1925 in Chihuahua, Mexico. He was born into a fanatical Mormon family who had started a compound within Mexico. To give a little bit of background, because it matters for this story, in 1890, the Mormon Church officially made polygamy illegal within its organization. In other words, if you wanted to be a Mormon or part of the main body of the Mormon community, you couldn't take part in polygamy. There's this stigma around Mormons that kind of say that polygamy is just what all of them do, and it's like the main tenet of it. But as a matter of fact, it's shunned a lot, and polygamy is absolutely the exception rather than the rule. However, because of that ban, polygamists who still believed that polygamy should be a part of the religion began to branch off and started their own compounds. Ervil's father took a group of about 30 families to Mexico and started his own group there. Ervil, being raised in this environment, definitely had a profound effect on him. So much so that whenever his father died and his older brother Joel was given control of the church and therefore the people within it, it made Ervil jealous. In protest, Ervil broke off and started his own church known as the Church of the Firstborn of the Lamb of God. That has 3 ofs in it. And while running this church, he ordered his followers to kill his brother Joel. To which they did, and Ervil's other brother took over that church, to which Ervil tried to have that brother killed too. So in 1974, he was arrested because it came out that he had his brother assassinated, essentially. However, after he was convicted of the murder of his brother, he was released on a technicality, although it's widely believed that he paid off the court. To which the group of followers that he had amassed were so devoted that whenever he was convicted and arrested, his followers began tearing up towns and trying to get him out of prison, and people died in the ensuing chaos, and it was a whole mess. After being released, Ervil carried out several killings on other polygamists who opposed his particular ideas. See, the way it essentially worked after the breakup of the polygamist sect from the normal sect of the Mormon religion is all of this polygamist groups went and started their own groups around the southern United States and northern Mexico. So while having core tenet beliefs, they were separate on their communication and the way they interacted with each other. So several of these different families or churches essentially had problems with Ervil, seeing him as being too radical, and if any of them were too vocal about it, Ervil would have them killed. Of course, Ervil was too much of a coward to put his own neck out there, so instead he often had one of his several wives or his several daughters carry out the murders themselves. After this, it's believed that he began killing members of his own family who opposed or tried to leave the church. However, this can't be confirmed because everyone at the time was way too hush-hush about it. Not only did Ervil kill these people because they disagreed with him, but he also preached a doctrine known as blood atonement, which, similar to polygamy, is a very old and outdated idea within Mormon religion that isn't practiced anymore. However, again, like polygamy, Ervil was a big fan of it. The idea behind blood atonement is that some people are so sinful that the only way they could get into heaven is that they had to make themselves a blood sacrifice unto God, and then that is showing that you're sorry enough that God will let you into heaven. So not only was this so frustratingly evil because he just had people he didn't like murdered, he would get his followers to do it because it was the right thing for that person. In other words, if you want a bunch of your daughters or wives to kill another one of your daughters, you just go to him and say, "Oh man, like, our daughter is being so sinful and awful, she's going to hell. Unless we murder her, then she can get into heaven." Finally, on June the 1st of 1979, Ervil was arrested for killing a leader of another polygamist church. However, while in prison, he wrote a new Bible that gave his followers in over 400 pages a detailed description of why they should kill people that are sinful, as well as a hit list of who to murder. Ervil died a year after his arrest of a heart attack while he was in prison. However, that doesn't mean the murder stopped because of the aforementioned Bible. It's been estimated that since his death, 25 people have been murdered as a direct response to his teachings. Perhaps most notably were the 4 o'clock murders in Houston, where at 4 o'clock in the day, 4 different people were murdered around the city who had publicly opposed Ervil in life. And these hits occurred as drive-bys of people coming up to other people with guns in the middle of the city and shooting them. And while it seems like now the killings have stopped, again, 25 people who he listed in that book ended up being murdered. And because of that and all of the killings that he committed before, again, all at the hands of somebody else, in total, it's estimated that Ervil LeBaron killed, at the very least, about 35 people. John Haigh was born on July the 24th, 1909, in Lincolnshire to a very Protestant and conservative family. Most likely due to the strict religious upbringing that he had, at a young age, John said that he had several nightmares regarding religion. However, the one thing that he maintained from his parents' teachings was a love of the piano and a fondness for playing it. He would use this knowledge of the piano in order to gain access to more high-ranking members of society within London and other areas in the United Kingdom. And then from there, he would begin his life as a con artist. In his younger days, John was constantly in and out of jail for things like theft and fraud. And in 1936, he was arrested for selling fake stocks to high members of London society and decided that the best way to go about his future endeavors was to make sure that no one was alive to testify against him. However, he didn't want to get caught for this and had heard about a recently caught serial killer in France who dissolved his victims' bodies in sulfuric acid. So he decided to test this by killing mice and dropping them in vats of acid to see how long it took them to dissolve. After seeing it took mice about 30 minutes to completely disappear, he decided humans would probably take a couple days, and that would serve as a good way for him to get rid of evidence. So, when in 1943 he met his old employer, who he quickly became jealous of, he decided now was as good a time as any to act out his plan. His old employer worked for his own parents by managing their properties and selling and renting properties throughout London. John managed to develop a good repertoire with his old employer as well as his parents, and then one day lured John into a sub-basement beneath a property in London, to which John then killed him by beating him over the head. He then took his body and placed it in a 40-gallon drum of sulfuric acid. After a couple days, once it had melted, he dragged the barrel out to a manhole in the streets of London and then poured away the evidence. John told his former employer's parents that their son had ran away because he didn't want to join the military. This kinda sorta made sense since it was in the middle of World War II. However, it also didn't because, guys like rich London realtors don't really have to join the military. But that excuse worked long enough for John to be hired in place of their son until their son comes back. After about a year of John getting rich selling properties, his parents started to ask a lot of questions about why haven't we heard from him? Why is he only talking to you? This is weird. Until one day, John said that their son was back in town and wanted to meet them, and all they had to do was follow John into a basement beneath this property, and yeah, he did the whole acid thing again. Despite having murdered now 3 members of this family and stealing a lot of their wealth, he managed to gamble away almost all of it by 1947. He then met a rich couple known as the Hendersons, who he impressed with his piano knowledge and ability to play. And after becoming quick friends, he invited the husband over to his workshop that he was renting at the time, telling him that he had just invented a brand new invention. Whenever the husband, Mr. Henderson, walked into the workshop, John pulled out a revolver that he had previously stolen from Mr. Henderson and shot and killed him. He then went to the Henderson household and told Mr. Henderson's wife, Mrs. Henderson, that Mr. Henderson was very sick and she needed to come to his workshop right away. And whenever she got there, he killed her and then put both of their bodies in the acid. After liquidating a lot of their funds through means that weren't detectable by authorities, he managed to make about £8,000 while keeping the Hendersons' car and dog. But he decided that money wasn't enough, and between that and a combination of him gambling it away, he decided to kill again in 1949 whenever he had a rich widow come into that same shop, to which he did the acid thing again. However, this time one of the rich widow's friends, who knew she had went to visit this workshop, alerted police, and after the police got there and saw her expensive coat, they decided to search the property, to which out back at the edge of the property, they found various human remains on a trash pile. See, whenever John killed the first 3 people, it was in the middle of London and there were manholes everywhere and he could just dump it down into the drains. However, at this new place he was renting, there wasn't any form of that, so he had to dump the sulfuric soup mix at the edge of the property because there was nowhere else to store it. To which police found things that did not melt in the sulfuric acid, including human gallstones as well as the widow's pair of dentures. John was arrested for this and, while being interrogated, asked the question of if it was possible to ever be released from a mental asylum, and the interrogator was confused and was like, "What are you talking about?" And from that moment on, John just pretended to be crazy. He confessed to all 6 murders, as well as saying there were 3 more, however this was never proven. And during the entire trial made a fool of himself, saying that he was a vampire that drinks blood, and he had visions of God telling him he had to kill people, and he tried the whole crazy killer thing. However, considering the amount of care And again, the whole acid thing, that shows pretty good evidence that he was in his right mind when he did these killings. And John was hanged on August the 10th of 1949 and is known in history as the London Acid Bath Killer. Aldolfo Constanzo was born in Miami in 1962. He was born to an only mother who raised him in church, and as a matter of fact, Aldolfo grew up as an altar boy. Things seemed normal until Aldolfo was 10 years old and began to apprentice under someone who was an expert at Pelo Mayombe. This is a religious practice that, in my research, seems similar to voodoo, at least in its traditional roots. And while all of that isn't necessary to the video, what is necessary to the video is that the practice of this religion, at least at the time, involves animal sacrifice. Aldolfo began to succeed in this market and become very interested in it, so much so that when he grew up, he moved to Mexico City and started a business that was just dedicated to performing spells and rituals for clientele. And considering that all of his spells and rituals required some level of killing animals, the majority of people who sought out his services were cartel members and hitmen. As demand grew higher, Aldolfo continued to amp up the magnitude of these killings. Initially beginning with things like rats, he eventually amped up to the point that he was performing sacrifices with lions. However, as you can imagine, he eventually began telling cartel members that in order to perform accurate rituals, he would need human body parts. There were several bodies found around Mexico City during this time that would have entire pieces of their body missing, to which it was found out years later that these were victims of, if not Aldolfo, members of the cartel who were supplying Aldolfo with the body parts he needed. During this time, people who watched Aldolfo were so convinced that he was a true spiritual expert and had the abilities of the supernatural that they began to favor his leadership over that of several cartel families. So much so that when one cartel family rejected the amount of money he demanded for a sacrifice, he had his now devoted cult followers go attack that cartel family, to which 7 members of the family themselves were used in his rituals. So this guy went from being essentially a performance or person of interest for the cartel to now directly declaring war against their members. He began a compound in the outskirts of Mexico City where he would keep these body parts and perform these rituals, as well as beginning his own cartel ring, moving things like cocaine and marijuana. So not to talk about Mexican politics because frankly I'm not an expert on it. However, it's kind of common knowledge that the police don't really mess with the cartel too much because they're seen as being so powerful. And for a long time, the authorities just assumed that Aldolfo was just another branch of the cartel. That was until an American student who was vacationing in Mexico from Texas was kidnapped by Aldolfo, and then it was later found out that his brain was used in a ritual. Because of pressure from the United States, and more specifically Texas, who said that if Mexico didn't do the investigation, America would, Mexican authorities raided Aldolfo's compound, to which whenever entering, they found a giant vat that was burning in the middle of the room, with several human bones and then a brain placed in the middle of it. And upon searching the grounds around the property, they found an additional 15 bodies buried on the premises. At the time that this happened, Aldolfo, as well as some other high-ranking members of his cult, were in Mexico City on business. Aldolfo got word that the police had raided his compound, so he thought the police would be showing up any second. Completely unbeknownst to Aldolfo, in the motel he was staying in at the time, there was a domestic dispute happening a couple of rooms down. The police were called to answer that domestic dispute. However, when the police pulled up, Aldolfo assumed that they were there for him, so he broke out of the motel room with machine guns and started a gunfight with the police. So there is a total chance Aldolfo could have gotten away for God knows how long if he wasn't so paranoid he just shot at the first cop car he saw. During the shootout, Aldolfo, realizing he couldn't get away, ordered one of his workers to kill him as well as the other high-ranking members, to which he did in the motel, on May the 6th of 1989. Because of this, it can never be confirmed exactly how many people he killed. The confirmed number between the bodies that were found on the premises is 23, between all the human body parts and everything. However, considering he was doing this for years before he owned the compound, and the fact they probably dumped them other places, some believe that the number of people Aldolfo killed or had killed is quite possibly in the hundreds. Charles Starkweather was born on November the 24th of 1938 in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was born into a working class family and was bullied at a young age due to a speech impediment he had. Whenever he hit high school and took his first eye test, he figured out that he had very poor eyesight. As a matter of fact, he couldn't read the letter at the top of the eye chart. However, those around him just assumed that he was a slow learner, and he was also bullied for that. As a response to this, Charles began to bulk up at a young age and eventually began bullying those who used to bully him. When he was a teenager, he watched the movie Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean, and became so obsessed with it that he began dressing like James Dean and self-identifying as his character from that movie. He dropped out of high school at the age of 16 and 2 years later met a girl by the name of Carol Ann Fugit, who he quickly developed an interest in. Carol also claimed to be in love with Charles. I should mention she was 13 at the time and probably was not the best judge of character. One day, Charles was teaching Carol how to drive his car when Carol crashed it. Charles' father, who owned the car, was furious and kicked Charles out. At this point, Charles became much more violent and headstrong. At the time, he was working as a garbage man, but said that he was going to quit it and just begin a life of bank robbery. The first killing took place in 1957 when Charles was only 19 years old. He was at a gas station when he tried to buy a stuffed animal dog for Carol. However, he didn't have enough money, and the owner of the station said he couldn't buy it on credit. Charles came back later that night at 3 in the morning with a shotgun and robbed the gas station. He then forced the attendee, who refused to sell him the stuffed animal, to walk out into his car, and then at gunpoint, Charles made him drive into the outskirts of town, get out of the car, and Charles murdered him. He told Carol about the robbery. However, according to Carol, he never said that he murdered the gas station owner. However, the killing spree would begin in 1958. One day, Charles drove to Carol's house with a rifle and box of ammunition. Now, the details of what happened next specifically are very foggy, as both Charles and Carol have changed their story multiple times on it, sometimes saying Carol was already there when Charles arrived, sometimes saying Carol pulled up in the middle of the process. However, what is known is that whatever events occurred, Charles murdered every member of Carol's family. This included Carol's parents as well as her 2-year-old baby sister. He then hid the bodies at the back of the property and put a sign up in the front of the house that said "sick with flu." Charles and Carol then lived in the now vacant building for about a week. And I'm going to go ahead and address this now because it kind of changes the way you view the story. It is heavily contested if Carol was an accomplice in these crimes or a victim. Because again, she was much older than Charles. At this time, Charles was 19 or 20 and she was 14 or 15. According to Carol's eventual court story, when she got there, Charles had already murdered her parents. However, Charles told her that he was holding them hostage, and if she didn't do what he said, he was going to kill them. On the flip side of that, Charles attested, and there was some evidence to kind of hint to the fact that Carol wanted Charles to murder her parents so that she could have more freedom, and then was part of this joyride they were about to go on. Honestly, after reviewing all the information, I can't really tell either way. I can say that whatever case, she was probably manipulated heavily by Charles, but I don't know if she was like held at gunpoint or she was doing the holding at gunpoint. Either way, for 6 days, they stayed in this empty house until Carol's grandmother came over to check up on the family. When Charles answered the door and said no one's home, she got suspicious and alerted the police, but by the time the police got there, the two were gone. As a matter of fact, they had ran to the next farm over and killed the owner there and stole his vehicle. From here on out, vocally, I'm just going to say that Charles was the one doing the killing. However, keep in mind it could also be Charles and Carol. While driving that night, they got the vehicle stuck in the mud before 2 local teenagers pulled up and offered to give the 2 a ride. At some point, Charles had them pull over and murdered both of the teenagers. The 2 then went to a more rich area of Lincoln before breaking into a large house. They broke into the house of a wealthy businessman who at the time, the only people who were home was his wife and the maid. Charles killed the wife and then forced the maid to make Charles and Carol breakfast. And then whenever the husband came home, they killed him before killing the maid as well. They then stole the car that the husband had pulled up in and made their way into the outskirts of the city. At this point, the killings were pretty high profile, so much so that the governor of Nebraska activated the National Guard to look for whoever these rampage killers were. While driving, Charles and Carol heard about this development on the radio, and Charles decided they needed a car that wasn't so high profile. There was a traveling salesman who was asleep in his vehicle, which was parked on the side of the road on the outskirts of Lincoln, so Charles pulled up behind him and then murdered him before trying to steal his car. However, the salesman's vehicle had a parking brake on, which Charles didn't know how to work, so as he was sitting there trying to start the engine, he couldn't get the vehicle to move forward. A random passerby saw this happening and pulled off in order to help whoever it was having engine troubles, to which Charles pulled a gun on him. During a shouting match with him pointing the gun and the other guy saying he just wants to help, a cop drove by who recognized the vehicle as being the stolen vehicle from the murder house and realized this is the guy they're looking for. The cop turned around on the road, to which when he did, Carol got out of the vehicle and ran up to the cop car and said something to the effect of, "It's Charles, he's going to kill me." Now, this moment was heavily contested in court because the two arguments were A, either she was legitimately trying to get away and she saw this as her opportunity to get away, or B, she was doing this because she figured they've been made and it would look better in court if she tried to get away. Either way, Charles jumped back in the original stolen car and began a high-speed chase, reaching speeds of up to 100 miles an hour around the back roads of Lincoln, Nebraska. The chase went on for so long and got so intense that the police who joined in began leaning out the window shooting at the vehicle. Eventually, one of the gunshots hit the glass and a piece of glass flew through the air and cut Charles along his neck. Charles thought that he had been fatally wounded, so he stopped the vehicle in order to get medical attention, when in actuality it was just like maybe a centimeter deep cut. And then during the trial, as I said, Charles said that Carol was a willing accomplice in the entire thing, and Carol said she was a victim. That thing that I've mentioned earlier in this iceberg, like, you know, back in the 50s and times beforehand, they didn't really care how many people you killed because one kill equaled one death penalty. Well, that's exactly what happened. Despite having 11 counted murders, he was only convicted of one and given the death penalty. At the time, it was found that Carol was complicit and a part of the murders, and she was given a life sentence. However, she only served 17 years of it. Charles had no final words at his execution. However, in a final letter that he wrote to his dad, he said, "I'm not real sorry, we had real fun." And Charles was executed by the electric chair on June the 25th of 1959. This is weird. So the next entry in here is Bevan Spencer von Eyman. He was an Australian serial killer. And I did all the notes and the research for him. However, I understand why he's at the bottom of the iceberg. The reason for it is because the manner in which he killed children is so brutal that I get why he's down here, right? But everyone kind of hyper-focused on that online, and there's not a ton of research or information, at least I found super readily available, about him growing up or whatever, and it kind of just became a show of like, wow, isn't this brutal, like what he did to these children? And you know what, I'm not going to cover it. I don't want to cover it, especially because like with what I found, if I was to do this, it'd just be like, and he killed some kids, and that'd be the end of it. But I don't like this guy, and it's my channel, and I do what I want, and I'm not going to talk about it. So as a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? What's the word for treaty? As a truce, there we go. As a truce between me and you, because I'm taking another name out of this. I was considering doing another serial killer video that is a slightly bit more lighthearted, and that being serial killers from history, like Vlad the Impaler, and whatever the name is of that Turkish guy who killed like 100 people, and things like that, like historical serial killers. So I'm going to go ahead and put myself on the stand, since I'm taking another name off this list, and say that I will definitely, in the near future, do a video about famous serial killers from history, so be looking forward to that. But yeah, I just don't want to talk about this guy, so moving on. Tony Costa, also known as the Cape Cod Vampire, was born on August the 2nd of 1944. He was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and his father died in World War II while Tony was only an infant. However, when Tony was 7 years old, he said that he began seeing a man who he identified as his father from pictures that his mother had, and said that he would come into his bedroom at night. So while this is in itself alarming, it was doubly alarming when, as Tony got older, he began exhibiting signs of sociopathy, particularly a lack of interest in care in family members or colleagues. In 1961, when he was only 16 years old, he broke into a girl's apartment and just stood over her bed. She screamed, called the police, he got away, and then 3 days later he came back and tried to drag her down into her own basement. However, neighbors heard her screams, came in and helped, and Tony was arrested. In 1962, he was convicted of this and only did a short stint in prison for breaking and entering, most likely due to his age. And after he got out, he married and had 3 kids, and his life seemed to be going well until he developed a drug habit. Although, while it's not entirely sure when the murders began, it's believed by most that they began in 1966 when 2 girls asked for him to give them a ride up to Pennsylvania, and they were never seen again. It was around this time that his marriage was falling apart, mostly due to his lack of care due to the aforementioned sociopathy, but also he was a heavy drug user and began going in and out of jobs. To the point where in 1968, he moved out to California for several months and began dating a woman there. However, that woman disappeared and women around him began disappearing. This began a cycle in which he would begin to see a woman or come into their proximity for a while, and then they just up and vanish. Also during this time, he broke into a doctor's office and stole about $5,000 worth of pharmaceuticals. And Tony managed to stay relatively below the radar until 2 girls who had told friends that they were going out with Tony up and vanished. The police began a search of the area they were last seen and found one of the ladies' bodies buried in a local cemetery. That started an entire search of the area until 1.5 miles away they found what Tony had been doing with the bodies. The bodies were cut up and seemingly being used as fertilizer for a drug garden that Tony had put together. It's believed by many that this wasn't just a means of covering up evidence, and that Tony believed there was some spiritual purpose to consuming drugs that were fueled by human remains. From there, Tony was arrested. However, he maintained a story that he was only the accomplice in a larger killing committed by someone named Carl. There was no evidence of a Carl ever existing, and Tony changed his story several times around this, so it was generally believed to just be a falsehood. And Tony was given 4 life sentences, 1 for each of the murders. While in prison, Tony wrote a book titled Resurrection that was a story of how this crazed killer named Carl committed all of these murders, and Tony was just a helpless bystander. Going as far as to say the people that he did definitively murder because the evidence for it was too strong were actually done as mercy killings so that he could free them from Carl's torture. However, this story didn't really take, and the next year in 1974, while in his cell, he unalived exit gamed himself. Yeah. Now, this was my last entry, or the entry that I added to the end, and it may not seem as over the top as some of the previous ones to you. I mean, that one guy was hunting people in the middle of Alaska. The reason I included this is because if you know this case, then you know a lot of the rumors surrounding it. According to the district attorney, and something that was never corroborated or proven, it was claimed that all of the bodies found had their hearts missing, the blood drained, and bite marks all over them. This is what got Tony the nickname of the Cape Cod Vampire, because it was believed by several that he was drinking their blood and using their organs for ritualistic purposes, and that the bodies found being used as fertilizer for these drug plants were just another means of that. After the research I've done, I believe he probably murdered 8 people. However, a lot of people like to say that he murdered exactly 6. 6 being the number of the devil, and the idea that this entire thing was some large ritual killing. So much so that people say that this Carl character he made up was either a possession or the devil himself forcing him to go about this, leading several people to believe that perhaps Tony Costa was a possessed serial killer, or a vampire. Pick your poison. Tsutomu Miyazaki was born on August the 21st of 1962 in Japan. Miyazaki was born prematurely, so much so that his hands were still fused together, and his entire life he was unable to spread them apart or bend them upwards at the wrist. He was born into a very wealthy family, however he had very distant parents who were more focused on their business lives rather than his well-being. Furthermore, Miyazaki was heavily bullied at school due to his deformity, and throughout his childhood was very quiet and reserved. For a long time he was a straight-A student until high school, whenever he began to drop off in schooling dramatically. He had moved out of his house for high school, and after doing poorly in high school, he moved back in with his parents and had to live in his sister's bedroom. It was during this time that he considered the console shut-off thing. However, his grandfather, the only positive influence in his life according to him, talked him out of it. During this time, he was constantly depressed and felt that no one in his house cared about him. This became all the worse when in 1988, Miyazaki's grandfather died, to which members of Miyazaki's family found him eating his grandfather's ashes. It was around this time that he said he was being actively ostracized by his family, for obvious reasons. However, things really came to a head when one day his sister caught him spying on her while she was in the shower, and whenever she said something to him, he attacked her. His mom was rightfully angry and began yelling at him, to which he began to physically beat his mom as well. Shortly thereafter, one day after his 26th birthday, Miyazaki was driving through the city when he saw a little girl playing by herself. He said that he felt relatable to her as both of them were people alone, so he decided to lure her into his car. He then drove out of town and sat in the back seat with her, parked in the car simply talking for 30 minutes before Miyazaki killed her. He left her body there in the woods, and every day for the next several weeks, he would drive out into the middle of the woods and just sit next to the body. One day, for whatever reason, he took off the hands and feet and decided to keep them in his house. While I couldn't find language confirming it, I believe at this time he was renting a small apartment apart from his family, since he was kicked out for the whole attacking his mom and sister thing. After this, every time he traveled back to the body, he would bring pieces of it back home with him. Eventually, he cremated the bones and sent the cremations to the young girl's family, along with a note saying that this was in fact their daughter's bones and that they should have them tested to prove it. Not long after this, he committed a second murder in much the same manner, continuing to go back and retrieve pieces of the body afterwards. In his third murder, he did the killing in much the same way. However, for an unknown reason, he dumped the body in an empty parking lot. After the fourth murder, again conducted in the same way, he brought the body home and began to drink its blood. At one point, he cut the body into pieces and scattered them around the city, but then became nervous afterwards, and seemingly from not wanting to be away from the body parts or fearing that they may be discovered, he went around and recollected them all. All these murders occurred between 1988 to 1989. During this entire time, he would cut out words from local newspapers and send them to the families of the children he murdered, terrorizing them. In several of these messages, he would detail what their daughter smelled like after she died, as well as give gruesome details about what he did with parts of the body. The murder spree finally came to an end whenever Miyazaki was trying to get his fifth victim. He saw a very young girl and her slightly older sister playing in a park and separated the younger sister from the older one. The older sister had got weird vibes from this man, so she went and told her dad. Whenever her dad came to find this weird man, he found that Miyazaki had made her undress herself and was taking pictures of her in the back of his car. The dad, rightfully so, tried to beat him to death. And while nearly crippling Miyazaki managed to fight back enough that he ran away. However, Miyazaki, in an act of unbridled genius, came back to get his car that same day, which, at that point the dad had called in the entirety of the Japanese police force, so whenever he showed up, they just arrested him. Upon searching his house, they found 5,673 VHS tapes. The majority of them were standard anime and Japanese television. However, several of them were illicit pornographic materials, and some of them were even recordings he took of the bodies after he had killed them. This started a moral panic in the media around Japan, and Miyazaki was given the nickname of the Otaku Killer. From everything that I read, this was like a one-to-one comparison of whenever there's like a school shooting in the US and they blame video games somehow, it was along that same line, only this time it was anime. During the trial, Miyazaki said that an entity known as Ratman forced him to kill the children. More specifically, he said that Ratman had always been his companion and by his side, and after his grandfather's death, had told him that the only way to feel better would be through murdering the young girls. There was such a huge debate over whether Miyazaki was in sound mind or not, that the trial went on for 7 years. During this time, 3 entirely different psychiatric teams came forward to determine if Miyazaki was of sound mind. The conclusion that they seem to have came to is that he definitely isn't of sound mind, but he's close enough that we can kill him. Essentially saying that he understood right from wrong and was smart enough to make sure he didn't get caught. At least, before he walked back to the car in the middle of a police investigation. In a lot of the interviews he had around the time of the trial, he said that his murdering of the children was an act of benevolence. And finally, on June 17th of 2008, Miyazaki was hanged in Japan for the murders of 4 children. And on that, we have the ending of the serial killer Iceberg. And I know a lot of that was depressing, especially there at the ending with all of the gruesome details of it. However, I want to make clear, and I've talked about this in the past, but I mean it now. You clicked on this video and you're looking at, I can definitively say now that we're at the bottom of the iceberg, you're looking at the worst of the worst, like as bad as it gets. And while I'm glad that you came to this little rabbit hole to go on this expedition with me, I want to emphasize that we're just in a rabbit hole. And the world is so much bigger than everything that I've talked about. This isn't even a fraction of a percentage of what the world is like. This is the bottom of the pit. And again, I've said this before, it's fun to go down the rabbit hole, but you've got to pull your head out of it every now and then to recognize that it's just a rabbit hole. And the world is a fantastic place full of beautiful people who do such beautiful things with acts of kindness and goodness. And maybe I'll talk about them someday, just not today. But I know one beautiful act of kindness that is being done right now, and that is you all supporting me by watching this video and allowing me to fulfill my dreams of talking about weird stuff on the internet full time. And it's entirely thanks to you all. So from the bottom of my heart, let me say, thank you for watching. I'm excited because now we can definitively say that this is the first Iceberg series that I finished. The Conspiracy Theory Iceberg started before this, and the last episode of that will be out soon. But this is the first one that's been complete. I think it's a total of, 5, 6 episodes now? And that's so wild. It's so wild to think that it started not too long ago. And I did a series. And it's done. It's the first completed series on the channel. That feels really cool. And it's really cool that you all are here to experience that with me. And it's really cool that you guys support me enough that I can do series like this. So thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate it. Like I said in it, also just to mention here, the reason I didn't go into the Einem guy is because the only reason he's here is because the killings were of a very explicit or sexual nature, to be frank. And I just don't want to talk about that. That's just a barrier I don't want to go into. A lot of people in the comments sometimes they'll say oh, so you're just afraid of getting demonetized? No, I just don't want to talk about some things, regardless of the monetary value of it. And I've got I think I mentioned in the last episode, there's some details that I just wish were still unspeakable, So while it's my platform, I guess in that regard, I'll say what I want. And I'm not going to say some things because I just don't want to. So that is my line in the sand, but hopefully to make up for it, because I know it's lame to have this content and be at the bottom of the iceberg and not get it. I will be doing the historical serial killer, and that's also something that I personally enjoy more. I think it's so much more interesting rather than to read about a guy who killed 4 people because he was just evil. These rulers who thought they were on a mission from God or whatever to wipe out blah, blah, blah. I think a lot of those stories are more interesting to read on. So a historical serial killer video will be out in the future. I'm not going to give a timeline on it because I don't want to lie. But that should be soon, so look forward to that if you're interested. This guy, I think there's like exactly, maybe it's more like 2.5 weeks. I forget. But after that, this guy will be gone forever. So if you're interested, get in on the pre-sale now while it's available. He's super adorable. I mean, just look at him. And thank you all for having that campaign do as great as it is. And it's all thanks to you all. It means the most. Thank you for the support. 850,000 subs. Like, that's so cool. Every time I see the number go up, I'm like, that's a whole, like, I never want numbers to just not mean anything to me. Like every time I look at it, say it's been a day and there's another like 400 subs. That's 400 people. That's a lot of people at once. And it means the most to me. I hope I never take it for granted. So thank you all for that. Thank you so much to my patrons that you can see here. I never take these names for granted either, especially not. You guys support me. These are my top tier patrons listed here. Thank you to them and all of my patrons. You guys support me so that I can do this. I cannot do it without you all. You guys are fantastic, and it means the most. So thank you so much for that. The next video should be the really long ARG, which if you've been paying attention to that whiteboard back there, that's a part of that. So that'll be coming up soon. I'm trying to think what else. The final part of the conspiracy theory iceberg, the historical serial killer video, and I believe that should be it for now. I also am having, I'm not going to say anything yet, but I have some ideas for a Christmas theme video. It may not be as good as the Christmas with the Cranks one. I don't know if I could ever top that. But we'll see what happens. I'm not going to make any promises yet. Well, you'll have to find out with me. But I believe that should be it for now. So thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!